Welcome to Not Your Ordinary Parts, a podcast where we talk about hard things associated with the human experience with the goal of increasing awareness, growth, and healing. You may hear information from professionally licensed therapists, life coaches, healers, doctors, etc. This information is not medical advice or therapy and is not meant to replace actual therapy or instructions given by a doctor or a personal therapist. I'm your host, Jalon Johnson. My guest today is Lara Love Hardin. Lara is a New York Times best-selling author, a sought-after ghostwriter behind some of the most influential memoirs of our time, and the co-founder of True Literary, a full-service literary agency dedicated to amplifying powerful, transformative stories. But before she became the voice behind best-selling books, Lara was losing her own, her voice, her identity, her sense of self, buried beneath addiction, shame, and a system determined to silence her. To the outside world, she was the image of success, a mother of four, living in the suburbs, building a beautiful life. But behind closed doors, she was spiraling, caught in the grip of a secret opioid addiction that led her down a path of deception, identity theft, and ultimately incarceration. Her memoir, The Many Lives of Mama Love, is not just a story of addiction and recovery. It's a raw, unflinching look at motherhood, shame, privilege, survival, and the American criminal justice system. It's about what it means to lose everything, including your name, and still find the strength to rewrite your future. Lara's story reminds us that no one is beyond redemption, and that sometimes the most powerful voices come from the most unlikely places. So, Lara, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being my guest.
Thank you for having me. That was a great intro. You read a great intro there. I will also like to emphasize that I am not a therapist or
Sure.
a coach or a doctor.
I should have added survivor just for this episode. Huh?
So don't listen to me, people.
Also, I gave a brief introduction, but so that the audience can get to know you a little bit better, would you mind giving us a little bit of background about yourself and how you got to who and where you are today, please?
How I got to who and where I am today. So I'm happy to be who and where I am today is talking to you. And I'm happy to be here. And 16 years ago, I was not anyone you would have reached out to be on your podcast because I was incarcerated. I was friendless, jobless, homeless, carless, childless, valueless, I thought, self-worthless. And how I got to where I am today, it's interesting to like, life's always easier when you're rear view mirror. Like this led to this, led to this, led to this, and it all mattered. And there's a meaning and there's a pattern. But the short answer is I just didn't give up. Right. So a lot of failure and a lot of not giving up is how I got here, I think. But if I had to tell you exactly how, I have no freaking idea. Be real.
Sometimes failure can be the secret sauce to success. And, you know, people run from failure without knowing that you have to have failure as the building blocks to success.
Yeah. And some of us are just people who learn things the hard way. Right. That's it.
So true. Before we dive into the events that shaped your life, I want to start with who you were before it all. What was early life like for you, and how would you describe yourself growing up?
I grew up on the East Coast in Massachusetts. I grew up in a family that was chaotic and confusing and violent and with a lot of addiction and alcoholism, and that was never talked about. And I would say if I look back now and describe like how I grew up, I feel like I grew up alone. Like that's my sense. And so what that did, I think, you know, I learned really early on to sort of be who people needed me to be, you know, like I could assimilate into your family, anyone's family, and they would love me and invite me for dinner and invite me on their family vacations. And it helped me pretend. It helped me pretend. I learned really early on to pretend everything was okay when it wasn't. I learned very early on that you don't talk about emotions. I can't remember a single time, you know, this is again looking back, but I don't remember a single time in my family where people said, how are you feeling? How was your day? You know, and so my sort of trauma response, which becomes a superpower later, I think, was to throw myself into school. I loved being at school. I could be like an overachiever at school and get all of that attention and praise. And I hated the weekends because I didn't want to be out of school. I hated half day. We had half days. I was like, that was nothing more horrible than a half day because I couldn't be at school. Because at school, I could be someone different than I could be at home.
Mm-hmm. What was your address growing up? Because that sounds like my house.
Yeah. Wait, are you my long lost brother?
It's funny how we learn to like pretend and put on a mask to do what we have to do to get our needs met.
Here's the thing about what you just said. Like, was that my address? Because during all of that, I was convinced in my address that everybody else had a normal family. Yeah. Everybody else had a mom who's waiting with cookies when they got home from school. Everybody else had the sitcom family that I didn't have, you know? So it's very isolating when you don't know that your normal is more, your abnormal is more normal than you think, right? Like sort of this idea. And I carried this idea. It wasn't like, oh, I was a child, I didn't know better. Like I was in my 20s still thinking that, trying to create the perfect family that I thought everyone else had later on, you know? So it is really, gosh, it's such a gift. I mean, it's so easy looking back, but just to know, like, just what you said, like, was your address my address? Same. Like, God, would I have loved to hear that when I was a kid? You know what I mean? I mean, it's helpful now too, but I really needed it then more.
I think, you know, the way we grew up and the way our parents and our community were, I'll even say trained to be, was, you know, that statement, what would the neighbors think? Like, you have to keep everything inside. Everything is swept under the rug. Yeah. And then when you open that door and go out into the world, you present as if things are great. Yeah. What's even crazier than what the neighbors think, because that is acknowledging that the person saying that knows something's wrong. In my family, it was even more, you know, this was before gaslighting was a term or an intention or a thing, right? It was just human behavior, but it was this disconnect where my mom would say, we're such a close family. And I'd be like, wait, what? You know, like that thing where because then you're like questioning your own observations, experience, lived experience, sanity. You know, like, then what's wrong with me? Like, what? I don't feel that, you know? So that's even, it would have been clear if they said, don't, you know, hide this from the neighbors overtly. Someone said anything overtly, then you have an orientation around that, I think. It's confusing too, because I think innately in our bodies, we know that something's off, but then if our parents or our mom is presenting that everything's okay, we say, okay, well then maybe it's me. Maybe I'm thinking something's wrong. Yeah. But then to still know it, and you know, there's that war that's waging inside of you of, okay, I know something's off, but I don't know what it is, and nobody else is willing to acknowledge it. Yeah. It's funny because I haven't really thought about this memory. Not that now you're the therapist and I'm about to lie down on the couch, but I never thought about this, not writing my book, not anything. But I remember specifically the time my mom said that. And this is the craziest. We were in a psych ward because I grew up, I was the youngest of 4, which is a whole other story, not my book, but you know, my sister ended up dying she was a very extreme alcoholic as a teenager. My oldest brother was a heroin addict, and I didn't know. I just knew he stayed in the basement listening to Led Zeppelin. Like, no one talked about it. I didn't understand the chaos. And then I had a brother who would get in trouble with money and then check himself to hide out in the psych ward or threaten, you know, suicide to sort of escape the trouble. And so we were in that psych ward for the 3rd time for my brother when she's telling the family therapist that. And I was like, I don't know what reality I'm in, you know, like, but it was just that sort of disconnect where we're not talking about the stuff, you know, like the giant elephant, not even in the room, but like crushing everything in the room, I guess. Okay, that's the end of my childhood therapy. Yeah. Thank you. I'm so sorry to hear about your sister. And yeah, it seems like I had a brother died of a drug overdose too, which I didn't really write about in the book. Yeah, I did my whole childhood in like 2 paragraphs. It seems like pain was a theme in your family growing up. Is that something that was passed down like generationally when you think back, or? Yeah, I mean, looking at it now as a kid, you're not thinking in generations, you're thinking in hours. Right.
You're thinking, and like, I'm scared in my home this afternoon,
Mm.
you know? But yeah, my mom, I come from a long line of women who kept secrets, who
Mm.
were silent. And, I had a grandmother I never met. She killed herself before when my mom was pregnant with my sister, and like no one ever talked about that. So there's just all of this sort of silent trauma and sadness passed down. I think that's sort of the legacy I inherited without understanding it till way later.
It's funny
And
that you
later
said
realizing
legacy.
it's not mine
Yeah,
too.
yes,
You know,
yes. Right.
like,
So
you know,
legacy is a strong word because if we think about what we want to do for our kids or how we want our, generational accomplishments to be remembered, that'll be our legacy.
mhm.
But for your legacy, what was passed down to you to be secrets and pain, and then to have to live in it and watch it, like, do you think that because of that, when you look back, that may have influenced who you became later, even like on a cellular level that you weren't even aware of?
Yeah, I definitely believe that. I think, um, I think one of the things that I learned sort of implicitly in from that legacy was like, you never ask for help, right?
Mm.
You don't like, I've been asked before, like, if you could go back and tell yourself, your younger self, something, I'd be like, ask for help. Like, but
Mm.
that sort of, part of it is personality and sort of it's nature, nurture, whatever. But that inability to ask for help, like, my mom, if you said like the house could be burning behind her, like flames, timber, ceilings crashing down, and she'd be like, it's fine, just a little warm, like that's what I learned. Right. So I'd be like, no, I'm fine, I got this. And so, a gift, I think, one of the superpowers of hard childhood experiences, I think, these sort of trauma responses, like I learned really, super independent. I'm super like good in a crisis. I'm resourceful. That adapting to who people need me to be made me a great ghostwriter later on. Like that empathy is huge. So like those are all gifts. At the time you don't see that, but I always even tell maybe 2022 is when I learned this. We're only barely into 2025. So before my book came out, but after it was in the works, I was like, I always thought I had this baseline of sadness. Like my baseline is a little bit sad. I could skew a little emo. And I'll admit when
Mm.
I feel the mood to wallow, I'll play Adele, I'll David Gray, I'll lean into it, right? And I like that sort of melancholy feeling. But it was only learning that like this sadness baseline really on a cellular level was like my mother and my grandmother. It wasn't like mine to carry. And like the realization of that, and it's a whole other story how I and journey about how, which is not in the book, about how I like really got that clearly. But that was like, oh, actually my baseline before life happened is like playful, and I'm slightly immature, and I'm joyful, and I'm silly, right? But
Mm.
like you don't play when you're in survival mode, right? Like
Okay.
you're not playing and being silly, which is fun, And so it was a real late in life self-awareness of a whole different kind. It's like, oh, I'm not sad. I'm the opposite of that at who I am. But you had to sort of let go of that unwanted legacy, right?
Yeah. So let me ask you this.
Hmm.
You said if you can go back, you would ask for help. Who would you have asked?
Um,
And I say that because thinking about it now and knowing your family system and the structure
yeah,
of how everyone else was in survival mode and everyone else was, maybe not even in a position to help, knowing that you wanted help, who could you have asked that maybe you could have received it from?
yeah. I think, I'm talking in my 20s, I would have asked for help. Or my
Oh,
third,
okay.
like, I would have asked for help instead of go to jail, basically, at
Mm.
that thing, if I had learned how. But I think as a kid, I don't think, um, I don't know who I would ask for help, And by the time I really needed to ask for help with addiction, I was so invested in who I wanted the world to think I was, who I wanted my community to think I was, who I want, who my own, um, you know, self-image that I wanted to be, even if it wasn't true, that I couldn't ask for help. And as a mom too, this is the thing, we're jumping ahead in the story, but I was struggling with opiate addiction like 40 million people are right now, and legally prescribed originally. But I remember thinking, I can't ask for help. I can't admit a problem. Fundamentally, even if I could get over it myself, I could never be 30 days away from my children in rehab. And like the
Mhm.
irony of that thinking when, again, if you read the book, you know what happened. I was gone for a year, and not in a nice cushy rehab. That's for sure, and gone and lost them in other ways forever, not emotionally or as their mom, but just in terms of like having the thing I took for granted, like those moments of like, I can fit you all in my house and everyone has a bedroom, and
Mhm.
we can do our homework and sit down to dinner at a big table, like those things that I just had and completely took for granted until I didn't have them. And I had no idea it would take me so many years to get that back, and by then, children don't stay where they are when you're getting stuff back. They're
Yeah.
like, they're off at college. Like, I don't want to sit at your table right now. I'm in my
Mhm.
dorm. So, so I wish I could have asked for help then. And I did have friends who would have helped me and would have stepped in, but I could not get out of my own way in my own self-image then.
We're only a few minutes in, and I love this interview so much already.
Oh, good. I love this therapy
um,
so much already. Thank you.
what was your relationship like with authority when you were younger? Were you, someone who played it safe, or were you always like pushing the rules?
Oh no, I was such a rule follower. Like
Really?
I was an annoying girl in front of the class. Like, I have the answer, a little skewed, a little bit know it all. But no, I liked authority because I like to know the rules of the game I'm playing, right?
Mhm.
Even even and it's not like I've always been a rebel wild. I do my own thing. Like, no, I don't. Like, I don't drive a mile over the speed limit, like I don't. And even in my addiction, like I knew right from wrong. I knew I wasn't living according to my values and my moral compass, and um and even like in jail, I followed all the rules. In probation, I followed all the rules. I didn't know how, like, sometimes that doesn't matter. I learned that, but I would have no way of knowing that. But in general, I'm a rule, I'm a rule follower, I would say in general.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
how does
certainly
that?
like the law, like structure, but
All right, I guess
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
come back to that.
Now I'm like, is this
um,
true? Am I a rule follower? No.
so later in life, you became an addict, and addiction oftentimes is a lot more than just substances. So before the opiates, do you feel like there was any other feelings of addiction, whether it was approval, control, perfection, or anything like that?
Well, I would say yes to all of that, but really the first sentence of my book is reading was my first addiction. And
Mm,
addiction for me, in all the spectrums was just about escape. Like, I had this idea that there's a better me than whoever I was, there's a better place than wherever I was, there's a better world than whatever life than whatever I was living. It was always this thing. And so books, which is a healthy addiction to have, right? Like,
yes.
the jails aren't full of people, stealing to fund their Kindle habit, right? It's not like a thing, but I read sort of like to escape. It was my first addiction, one, to just like escape what was happening around me, like, again, the house could be in chaos and I'd just be in my closet reading my books, like hiding out, doing my thing. And people in books made sense. Like their motivations always made sense in books, right? Like and there was happy endings and
Mm,
and just like clear motivation. So when everyone around you is, they're like, why they're doing what they're doing is confusing as a kid, like you get a book and it's got a beginning, middle, and end, like, oh my gosh, that's crack, right? That's like,
structure, yeah.
yeah, it's structure. But it's also like, you understand why people are doing what they're doing. If you're in a house where people are doing crazy things and no one's talking about it, you don't understand and you internalize it, right? So I was
Yes.
like, oh,
Yeah.
I'm the problem. Like, what's wrong
Mm,
with me? So I think I think this what's wrong with me. led me to addiction. I think it's a mixture of like personality, and I have genetics in my family, and also this idea that I learned really early on that like there's something wrong with me. Like I'm all alone. I'm, I don't like my dad is never here. Like I don't have a dad, so he didn't love. You internalize all that stuff as a kid without any other. What else could there be? You're also, you're a kid, so you're the center of the universe, and everyone's spinning around you. And so if there's problems, you're the problem. So I think I had that, and that sort of like, and then that idea that I had to be. So I was addicted to approval. I loved making people like me. I'm only recently at my age pretty cured of that. But it's natural, we're wired to belong and to be in a tribe and like not be rejected and isolated. I think it's like, evolutionary. Um, but, and then when I was, you know, not a kid, but not an old lady, I was like, oh, if I can make you love me, even better. It's just like sort of this emptiness, like what from outside me can I grab and hold on to feel better, whether it's like food or sex or relationships or books are harmless, but like all this thing where I just was not okay in me and I didn't understand how to unpack that. And I would never say, hey, that's something I need to look at. Like, I don't know. Um, and I thought I was really good at hustling the world too. That I was like, look how I have it together. Like, look what I'm presenting to the world, like, and so I was so invested in how other people saw me. Which is a really also like adds to the loneliness. It's a super lonely place to be.
I'm certain we grew up in the same house now.
I know.
So this desire you had to, I guess, convince the world that you had your stuff together and everything under control, was that something that you really believed, or deep down, do you feel like you knew at a certain point it was all going to fall apart?
I mean, it depends. Like, I think before I had children, I it wasn't as pronounced, right? But when I had children, I was so determined to, and I think we all kind of do this when we have kids, where I think we all end up either just like our parents or determined to do the opposite of our parents. And then we find out we're a little bit like our parents, like
Mm.
all of those things. But I really, like I said earlier, like so convinced everyone else had the perfect family that I was going to have the perfect family. And so that is just a trap as a parent. It's a trap as a mom. It leads that inability to ask for help. I was like, my mom was never there, so I'm going to be there 24 hours a day. And this was before, people are now, like your podcast, talking about mental health issues and addiction more openly, right? It was not, whether it's postpartum depression or like depression or anxiety, all those things, like it wasn't talked about in the mid 90s, right? Like it just wasn't a thing. And mom shame is its own unique kind of shame, and so I was late to addiction, but part of it was, I was really struggling. I had 3 boys in 4.5 years, straight out of graduate school. I wanted to have the perfect like sitcom family, and I didn't marry the perfect sitcom husband, and he certainly didn't marry the perfect sitcom wife. And so when my marriage was falling apart, I was so depressed at the loss of that, like perfect. I had just
Mm.
grown up saying, I'm going to do this differently. I'm going to have the perfect family. I'm going to have like a whole, that thing. And when you're trying so hard to be perfect, it doesn't leave room to say, hey, but also I'm like really sad. And also, I recently read this book that this woman wrote with zero shame, all about postpartum depression. And her book opens up with her with a young child, in a hotel room doing drugs, zero shame on her part, right? Which is like like great. And it's really this all about postpartum depression, how like it just threw her. And I was like, it made me rethink my own villain origin story that I had for myself, right? Because I was like, I had 3 boys in 4.5 years. My husband was cheating on me. I took my first pain pill because for emotional pain during that time, right? In my like, and I was like, did I have postpartum depression? Was that the root of all this? I don't know. Did I just have depression? And like, because I remember taking one pill that was legally prescribed to me, the way it worked in my brain. It helped me pretend I was happy when I wasn't. It helped like it be more fun to play army guys, which is not that fun sometimes, like, or to do laundry. Like it was just like this, or to like struggle to, make a utility bill arrangement because we were young and poor and I had 3 children and now I was a single mom. And so, I think about all of that from a different lens and it can change. You do another interview in a year and I'll be like, no, here's my story. This is what actually happened. Like it's all evolving. I think, which is, what happens when you sort of make sense of your own story at some point, and sort of connect the dots. So I don't know. I don't even know if I answered your question.
You did. All right. So let me ask you this.
Yeah.
If you could narrow it down to one thing, what would you say you were running from?
Myself.
Can you expound on that?
Let me see if I agree with myself before I say that. I think I was running from the truth that I was not as okay as I pretended to be. I was running from the truth in myself that I didn't have it all figured out, that I had no idea what I was doing, I think I was running. If I didn't say the word myself, I would say loneliness. It was a toss up between those 2 words in my head, but I think myself, and I think a core thing of that is I just felt profoundly alone my whole life. And I'm great. I could say I'm great at being alone. I'm not great at being lonely though, so I think it was a combination of things. I think I desperately wanted to have deep connections and I had no idea how to do that. I desperately wanted to be loved and I didn't feel lovable. I definitely didn't desperately wanted to belong and I didn't feel like I really fit in anywhere. But I could pretend that I did. But deep down, I didn't have those things all integrated for whatever multiple reasons. And I was highly functioning on the outside world. I was like smart and I could be funny and I could like charm you and I could do all those things, which is even a lonelier place to be because no one could see it. It's like you desperately want people to say, hey, I see you. And you're desperately afraid, or I am, but wait, I don't want you to see me, but I really want you to see me. Like that was sort of the tension always, and I think that's what, apart from brain chemistry, opiates for me, it wasn't, I think the stereotype is that people are like, oh, you're going to check out and fall asleep and numb. And for me, it did the opposite. I was like, I'm actually smarter, funnier, more connected. I can tell you how I feel easier. I have more of a language for emotion. If I had a pain pill in me, I could be like, I'll tell you, I love you then, or I hate you then. Like, it just like, it gave me this courage but it's insidious, that kind of thing, because then you need it. You think you need it for that courage to feel anything, to feel joy. And it also just increases the separation and loneliness. It kind of fed into that thing. Because I remember, and I tried to stop a million times. Like I knew it was a problem. It wasn't like I was out of my mind. I was highly functioning. I was a school board member, little league coach, all those things on and off. But I would try and quit, and I would quit for a week. And then I would start again thinking that proved I didn't have a problem because I could quit for a week. But I wasn't looking at the fact that I kept starting again. But I remember being somewhere and looking out the window and seeing everybody on their bikes on a Saturday and out for a walk. And I was like, how do people do that? How do they just feel joy? Like they can just go for a walk or a bike ride and they don't have to pop 20 pills to do that. Like, like I really lost my ability. That is my nature to like I said, play and be silly. And like, I'll talk to strangers all day long, but it just creates this weird thing where you think you need it. And then you do need it. And then you like, I was, I could talk to a room full of 1,000 people easier than I could talk to you one-on-one and have you look in my eyes or having a conversation. Dear God, that's terrifying. Terrifying.
I'm with you.
Terrifying. Look away.
It feels like you are talking about me as I listen to your story because I can relate to all of it emphatically. And to be able to have someone have a language for that emotional loneliness and that confusion and all the things that create the trauma of not being okay with who you are internally is so huge.
Mm-hmm.
So huge. I wanted to ask a question about opioid addiction. What's something that is misunderstood by a lot of people about opioid addiction that you would
Yeah.
say?
I think like no one grows up. Like I wasn't, in junior high school, like, dear diary, I hope someday I can be addicted to opiates and hurt everyone I love, or I hope someday I can go to jail. Like no one wants that for their lives. But I think the thing that's really hard for people to understand is, and this is specifically like as a mom, like I never once didn't love my children. I never once would not have thrown myself in front of a car, plane, train, bus, whatever, to save their life or any child's life. It doesn't even have to be my own children. Like that was all true, even in my addiction. But that love wasn't enough to stop. And I think people can't reconcile that. It's really hard to reconcile. And people take addiction really personally in their family, right? Like if you loved me, you wouldn't do that. If you loved your children, you wouldn't do that. And I think what people don't understand, and it's so hard to describe, that your very survival feels like it, like we're also wired to survive. Like, something's flying us, we're going to duck, right? We're going to self-preserve. And so the compulsivity of addiction, like what started out as like, here's a pain pill, made it a little funner to join my afternoon, turned into, if I don't have something in me, I'm going to die. Like it really feels like that survival, not like hyperbole, but like it really feels like your survival depends on it. And so I knew I wanted to stop, and I was like, I'll have to stop tomorrow because I can't survive today if I don't do it. And then so I need to do it, and then I'll figure out how to stop doing it. But that tomorrow just kept like, it's like a game of kick the can, it's like the next day I can't handle it. So I think like that compulsion, even in the face, when you can be the smartest person in the world, and this is destroying your life, this hurting people you love, that you're self-destructing. It's a very, my addiction was just a very inefficient way to try to kill myself. It was just a very slow, like, it's like death by 1,000 paper cuts kind of thing, but it was self-destruction, right? And so I think, people try to approach things logically, and I do too. Like, well, if you know that, why would you keep doing it? And it's so hard for people to understand that. And for me, until I was stopped, I could not stop. And luckily I was stopped, because I probably wouldn't be alive here today talking to you.
I'm so thankful for whoever stopped you.
The man. Yeah.
So what you just described, is that addiction in general or opioid addiction?
I think it's addiction in general, but again, it's different for some people. Addiction is like, oh my God, I just partied too hard and now like I can't stop partying. Like I think it's such a spectrum and so unique to everyone's particular brain chemistry and how they grew up and all the things. So opiate addiction for me would be different for someone else. Like I said, opiates in my brain have the opposite effect of most people. Most people are like, oh my God, I take a pill, I'm so sleepy. And I'm like, I'm shinier, right? I'm the hostess of the world. Like it made me feel more beautiful in every way. Didn't look like that at the end. I looked 95 years old and was dying, but it was just like, it just gave me courage that I didn't have. Like it was a coping mechanism until I had other things. And I think, so I think whatever the addiction is for whoever is different. And everyone wants a formula and a recipe. And if you, this plus this plus this equals, you're going to become an addict. And I can never give that. I know for me, it was just a symptom, right? My addiction was a symptom of something else, of my longing for connection, my longing to be seen and connect with people in a way that I didn't have the tools to do. I mean, now I'll have a deep connection with a random stranger, whether they like it or not. But back in the day,
Did you ever see yourself as an addict? Was there a point where you said, "Oh man, I'm an addict," or was it just a continuing like avoidance of what was actually going on?
No, I knew. I mean, the first, I didn't think at that first pill I took, right? I didn't think it was like I'd taken 3 in one day and I was like, "Oh no, I got a problem." Because I grew up with addiction. I was swore I would never be like my family.
Mm,
I thought I could out educate that away. Education is inoculation. If I'm just smart and geographically far away, I will not be like them. Um, so I knew, I played little games. Like I said, I'll quit for a minute. So maybe I'm not really that bad, but I always knew it's not what I wanted to be, and that it was that I didn't want it. I just didn't know how to not have that in my life, I think. And it's really specific for me. It was opiates. Like I've never been a pot smoker. Like I don't like that. Speedy drugs. Like I don't want people to tell me it's ridiculous. I don't like small talk. So being around people on speedy drugs is like the nightmare I could imagine, like, let me tell you what I did when I was 3. That's not like that kind of stuff I didn't like to do. And never a big drinker really, except for um, college, but just normal. But it was really specifically in my brain chemistry, opiates were magical for me.
mm. Um, Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about how everything came crashing down.
Mhm.
How did you get caught, and what exactly were you doing?
So I got caught because I'm not a criminal mastermind.
Mm,
um, no, I think what happened was the opiate addiction, like it is for many people, it's really hard to get prescription pain medication after a while, and so that turned into smoking heroin, and that was because my husband at the time, who was had also struggled with opiate addiction. Like I found it in the house. I didn't know what it was. Um, I literally Googled how to smoke heroin on my way to volunteering at my kid's Montessori school. Like it was just like I was a suburban mom in a cul-de-sac, and um, and holding it together, highly functioning. Um, and it was 11 months from the time I Googled how to smoke heroin to the time I was in handcuffs and the beginning of my book starts. It was 11 months to destroy a life, hurt people I cared about, lose everything. Um, and it was, yeah, horrific. Like it was just this thing. And I knew that's not who I wanted to be. But what happened is I started running out of money. I stopped going to work. My world became very small. I started coming up with what I thought were brilliant lies about why I was late places. Like I think I was starting to get late to pick my kids up from school or like show up their games. I think I told stories to my friends. Like I think I said my car had been stolen like 4 times. I've never had a car stolen. Like it was just like you make up these stories to guard your secret with your life. I did, not you. I did. Like my addiction was my secret lover, right? It was like, okay, I'll just do this. This makes me feel okay, and I can get it together and keep it together, and I can stop. But it was just like went on and on and on until I had lost everything. And I started stealing from my kids are in private school, and I started stealing from my friends would leave their purses in the car while they brought their kids into school, and I would reach in and grab some cash or grab a credit card, and in my mind, I'd take a credit card. I'd take your credit card and I'd be like, well, you're not going to really lose money. It's just the credit card company. Like I was justifying the right
mm,
from wrong morally to myself because I knew it was wrong. Or I'm going to take your credit card, but I'm only going to buy groceries with it for my kids. Now, like logically, that's because I'd spent my money on drugs, but there's virtue in that. I'm stealing to feed my kid. It's like all these mental gymnastics you do or I did. I know I keep saying you. I did to excuse, to like make it make sense and to make it fit my sense of right and wrong, which I had a strong one. Like me, I became who I was not. Like who I am, like in my nature without drugs is like generous and kind. And what do you need? How can I help you? You want my last dollar? Here's my last dollar. And let me borrow a dollar to give you another dollar. Like that's who I am. So the dissonance between that being my nature and me being like, I'm going to steal from my neighbor's checkbook and write a check, like that kind of thing. Um, you have to do drugs to not think about that, right? But it was just like eventually caught up with me, and and the police came pounding on my door and arrested me and my husband, who, we went from husband and wife to co-defendants, which is, pretty much when the romance, the love story's over, right? Um, and and I make jokes, but that day it was a hugely traumatic day for my family, for me, and it's one of those things where, for 15 years I dream about that, which is a sign of trauma. But for a long time, over a dozen of those years, I was like, well, I know this is traumatic and it's showing up in all these ways that like a PTSD does, but I caused it. So I can't heal from it. I can't go get help for that. This is not that long, because it's trauma I caused myself. Like I had a disconnect between like what you deserve to heal from and what you don't, for me, right? Which is super interesting. But the police came and arrested me, and my 4 boys and my 3 older boys were in junior high and school and high school, and my youngest was 3, almost about to turn 4, and he's the only one home. And CPS came to take them. I was begging and crying the sheriffs to let me call someone to come pick them up, a family member. And in their mind, I was someone who had stolen credit card from people I knew about, and there was some drugs in the house. And so the idea that I was still a loving mom, and that like I wanted to protect my son, and he had never been a night away from me. They didn't reconcile those two things, and so they called CPS, he's at that stranger danger, and he's crying, and I'm handcuffed saying, it's okay, these are friends, because I'm trying to make it okay for him. And he's reaching his hands up to have me hug him, pick him up, and I'm handcuffed. Like, that's the moment when I couldn't lie to myself anymore. I still get emotional all these years later. There's no story or mental gymnastics you can do I could do in that moment to face anything but the reality. And so while a part of me was relieved to be stopped of this sort of cycle of misery every day that I was in, using and using, finding more and finding a way to keep this addiction going, the reality of that moment, I was like, that's it. I just failed at life. Like, there's no coming back from this.
That sounds awful. And I'm sorry that you had to go through that. I'm sorry that you couldn't hug your son in that moment when he was reaching up for you. You talk about the humiliation, the exposure, and the raw terror of the experience, and you've just described it. And I think, for people who may have experienced similar things or just rock bottom, it's very understandable. And a lot of us, like I said, don't have someone who's telling their story that we can relate to and say, yes, like, I know that, so that's why I'm grateful for you to have experienced what you experienced, and didn't, just keep it to yourself, but to provide a bridge for those who don't have the language or don't have the emotional capacity to even formulate words or feelings to understand that just because you hit rock bottom doesn't mean that's the end.
Yeah.
And you're a tribute to that.
Yeah. I mean, it when I was taken from my little cul-de-sac, which was in an area where they don't see police cars filling it up normally, right? The whole time on the way to the jail, I was like crying in the car and like, say, where's my son? Can you just tell me where are you taking my son? Where's he going to go? And when I was being brought into the jail, there's this little sort of no man's land entryway. Before, outside the jail, there's cameras, and inside the jail and booking, there's cameras, and this sort of like between 2 doors. And I remember the sheriff brought me in there, and he like grabbed my arm. He had a hold of my arm, and he squeezed me really hard. And he said to me, "You will never see your son again, and you should not be anyone's mother." When I am at my lowest, and I believed him, right? I believed him, and so that in some ways was like the moment where I was like, oh, all those things I feared as a kid, like that I'm secretly bad and that I'm unlovable and those things. It was like that was the crashing moment there where I was like, there's no redemption arc for me because I don't deserve one. Like I really, really believe that. Um, you know, last thing I thought of in a moment was like, oh, someday I'm going to have a book about this. Mm-mm. It was like, get me through the next 2 days so I can end my life. Like, get me to a place where I can end this because there's no mulligans here in this life. There's no,
Mhm.
like, there's no, I don't deserve another chance. I don't deserve an arc to this story. Like, I have done the ultimate, most horrible thing I could ever do.
You said that jail stripped you of everything, including your identity as a mother, a wife, and even a person with a name. And thinking about that moment where the sheriff said that to you, um, automatically I was angry at him. But then I thought about what he saw,
Yeah.
and he was angry at you for what you were putting your son through at that moment, right? So if I try and think about that, I try and, I guess, look at it from his perspective and yours at the same time. Um,
Yeah.
and I guess he wasn't really out of line
Mm,
because of what he was trying to do for your son, but also he was dehumanizing you. So,
the thing. I don't think he was thinking about, honestly, I don't think he was thinking about my son. I don't think when they came in, my son was sitting in front of around stuffed animals, a healthy snack, and a big screen TV. Like there's no part where he's like, oh my God, your son's in danger. He's in squat. Like there wasn't that kind of thing. It
mhm,
was, I think what it was, and he could have easily, it's a judgment call. Said, yeah, go ahead and call a family member, take your son. Because that's what, if he was thinking about my
yeah,
son, well-being,
right,
he would have let me do that. But
right, right.
he was thinking about how do we punish, how do we dehumanize, and I would say that men and women in the justice system are treated very differently. You know,
Yeah.
there's no when a man gets arrested, I guarantee you the in a court, the judge or the sheriffs, they never say like, "How could you do this as a father? Who's watching
Mm.
your children?" Like, there's a certain level that is hard to. There's a certain there's a
Expectation?
huge difference, not a certain, there's a huge difference between how men and women are treated in the system. And I
Yeah.
think what he was and what I experienced and what a lot of most of the incarcerated women in this country, if not around the world, experience is that there's a lot of power and control that the guards really enjoy having over women.
Yeah.
Honestly, I mean, over
Okay.
people, over everyone, but I think, 100% of that population of incarcerated women have histories of trauma or domestic violence, and they're in a situation that is like, if you, if I give you the list of what are the red flag signs of domestic violence, for a woman, it's exactly what the system of jail is. Jails are built for men. They're mostly run by men, and um, they're not geared for women. As a woman, incarcerated women, you're 3 times more likely to be sexually assaulted, and that's by the guards,
Mm.
not as a free woman. This place where you have no control, no power, no credibility, and someone's controlling your access to your children, to the outside world, to what you eat, to what you watch, to whether you are free or not. Um, like that's just textbook domestic, like that's the red flags. So I didn't know any of that. And I'll be the first to say that I never thought about or cared about incarcerated women until I became one. I had
Mm.
no idea. And I always get asked, like, are things different now? Absolutely not. You know?
So I said he wasn't on a line trying to think about your son. I take that back
Yeah.
because I saw how you responded to it, and instantly I
Yeah.
said,
And
"Okay,
normally would be
I
like, yeah, but
misspoke."
actually, yeah, that one I don't. Look, I committed crimes. There's no part of me that thinks that I did not need to pay for my crimes.
Mhm.
Um, I think I think there's a difference between paying for your crimes and then all the ways you're expected to pay after and forever and for generations. I think public humiliation, dehumanization never helps anyone rehabilitate. So I
Mhm.
think um, there's a lot of Not everyone has your best interests in the criminal justice system, which should not be a shocker to anyone, right?
Yeah.
It's not a shocker to any woman who's been locked up. It's not a shocker to any Black man in this country, right? Like it's just like there is there's a lot of abuses of power that happen in all the different areas for everyone in the system. And that's still acknowledging, like, I'm a rule follower, like you said, like I committed a crime, I should pay for that crime. No
Yeah.
disagreement there.
I think it's safe to say that there's not like a weekly psychological training on how to treat criminals like humans. um,
You
so you
know,
kind of touched on this a bit, but what was something that jail taught you about power? Who has it? Who doesn't?
yeah.
And when it's taken away from you, like what happens?
Yeah. I mean, I think, to go back to what you said when you like, because we sort of conflated this with the sheriff, like having no identity, not being any of those roles, not being a name or number, like what a gift. Jail was the best thing that ever happened to me. I will say that all day long. Made me a better mother, made me a
Mhm.
better writer, made me a better friend. It made me a better human, like my experience, because like I said, I'm someone who learns things the hard way. I needed every single identity that I'd created in my life, every single mask I was piling on top of each other, every single fake it till you make it thing in me to be stripped away. Like there's an
Mhm.
easier process, like go to therapy, do some ayahuasca. Like I don't know what people have to do, but like, learn to meditate online, don't go to jail to learn. But like all of those things, like looking back, certainly not the time, are exactly what I needed. Like I don't regret that piece. I regret how I heard, that my learning things the hard way was my children's college essay topic, right? Like no one
Mhm.
wants that as a mom, but all my boys, I'm completely biased, but they are like amazing, kind, compassionate, funny, smart, wonderful friends and boyfriends and, all the things, and have resilience and humor. And I love all of that, but that wasn't the happily ever family story I wanted. It is what it is still, I can't rewrite the past, but jail was a gift in that way for me personally. I think you learn about power in a new way in jail. It's not like anything I saw on TV. You know, I was not, I would say 95% of the time never afraid of the women I was locked up with. I was always afraid of the guards who were locking us up, always.
Mhm.
Um, I think, the power struggles in jail, you take any group of people and you lock them in the place, you're gonna, you're gonna, there's gonna be power struggles. It wasn't that different than a PTA meeting or who's in charge of book club. Honestly, there's like who's in charge, who are we looking to for this and that. And so, I learned really early on in my childhood to read a room and read a community. And, the things that were shocking is, look, there's 3,116 jails and they reflect the demographics of the community, right? So Santa Cruz, California is not the most diverse town. And, really the biggest disparity in jail was between men and women, not between women based on like race or color, but the jail system itself is so racist so for me, I was like, oh, we're progressive. We're Santa Cruz. Like there's no racism. And then I was like, oh, look
Mhm.
at this, there's all these rules and people locked together and people are lining up in, I didn't know gang culture. I was like the PTA gang, like I didn't know all of those things. So it was a big education and an education in, the thing I learned too, which was not like, I had the privilege of never having to learn, right? Was that like, you're suspect if you do something for free. So everything was a trade, everything was a barter, and everybody had different skills. And I happened to be really good at writing. I'd stopped writing when I started doing drugs, but now in jail I wasn't doing drugs, so I started writing again, and that skill became valuable, and it was something that helped me feel valuable in myself. I started ghostwriting, listening to the women tell their stories, and writing letters to the judge as them to help them get, long-term treatment instead of prison, or to help them get a pass to go to a funeral or a graduation. I could hear their story and imagine I was them and write the letter to the judge as them. Um, and that was my skill set. I had an MFA in fiction writing, like that was my skill. Other people had other skills, and there's a lot of really creative, intelligent brilliant, traumatized women that I was locked up with. And so, and I'm sure that was probably a crime what I was doing in there, but it was a crime for good. So like, it was like, here, I'm going to help. I can't do this for myself. And when you're in shame, you don't really advocate for yourself, but I was really good at advocating for other people. And I broke up with a lot of people. I seduced a few people. Like I had some skill sets in the ghostwriting I didn't know. And it was fun, but mostly it made me feel at a time when I felt like the rest of the world and the world I had been in had completely written me off. I never had a friend from that cul-de-sac visit me in jail. No one in my book club, no one in the school groups. I never had I felt very much alone. And so the women I was in jail with saved me. And they taught me a system that I had the privilege of never learning about before that. Right. And so, and I also, even though, I was certainly a lot younger than I am now, I was still like an elder in there because my closest friend was 19 when I was incarcerated. My oldest son was 17 when I was locked up. So I was also a mom without her children. And I've always had a lot of mom energy. And so that's who I was, and, I think there's a lot of disparity in sentencing in the court system. But once you're a woman in control, being controlled by that system behind bars, you're all treated equally horribly, honestly.
Mm.
Different than the men, unequal with the men, but yeah.
Thank you for sharing that. Also, I was going to say you had a lot of privilege prior to going in jail.
Yeah.
And I don't think that privilege served you, but it sounds like you gained a different type of privilege while you were there.
Yeah. I mean, it served me in sentencing. Like I'll acknowledge that for sure, because I looked like your soccer mom, but also I didn't have a history of being in and out of jail, like I like to say I was a late bloomer and an overachiever to addiction, to criminal behavior, but yeah, there's no doubt that, and I think even I had a public defender. I didn't have money. I didn't have a private attorney. I did have some people in the community who wrote letters for me, which helped, and advocated, that I needed addiction treatment and mental health treatment, not jail. And that didn't work. The judge was like, no, you're not. But I also didn't go to prison and never be able to see my children again, which is what I was afraid of.
The women that you develop relationships with while you were in jail, do you still keep in contact with any of them?
Some of them. So some, here's what people don't understand. Like we're a huge support for each other in jail, and like, but the minute you get out of jail, so when I got out of jail, if I wasn't going to hang out with anyone who wasn't on the same path with me, including my ex-husband, like I jettisoned him because he was not like, what I went through was bad enough. I was, been 16 years last week since I did a drug, right? Last time I did a drug was in jail. But it's a crime for us to hang out when we get out of jail because we're felons. Felons can't hang out with felons. So that support system is gone. So that's the short answer of like, why not immediately? Some I stayed in contact with on social media who are doing well, but very few, I thought. But since the book came out, I've reconnected with a lot of the other women. And some of the ones who really wanted me to know how well that, like, I didn't know if they, some overdosed and some are in long-term prison, and then others are doing well, but I didn't know about it. And then they connected after the book. And one of them was like, 5 years a drug treatment counselor. And another one got out of prison, just got her MBA and is killing it in Silicon Valley marketing about a house. And I never thought, and then another woman who was a big part of my story, and I changed their names in the book. But another woman, I don't want to say her real name or even her book name because of competition, but she was working as a drug and alcohol counselor and just overdosed last week after so many years. And so like that thing and passed away is a big part of my story in there. And that was like really hard. It was like 2 weeks ago. And so a lot of people reached out when that happened because, the statistics are not good, but we also don't have very many stories. Like even I didn't have stories of people doing well after. So getting a few great stories, like he's connecting and saying, no, I'm doing great. Like, I read your book. I love it. Like, it's 5 years. I have 5 years clean and sober, and I'm this and that. Well, it felt really, really good to hear. And I don't know that I would have heard that without the book.
Mm.
There was a moment too. There was a woman who I was locked up with, and she, sent me a message on social media holding the book. She's like, I'm going to read it. And I was like, awesome. And then I had this moment, I was like, oh, it's going to be so funny if she reads it and then calls me and is like, wait, you thought you were a shot caller? Like, like that, because we're all the center of our stories, and she can
Right,
be like,
right.
what? You had zero, she didn't do that, but it was just this thing where we're all, even just like, writing my memoir, anyone in my book, if I could write the same story time frame and have a totally different point of view. Right. But I was worried how about some of them might take it. And if I'm telling secrets in there, am I snitching? Like there's a little bit of that. But the feedback has been really positive. And even when I went to Chowchilla prison with Oprah to do book club in there, like I didn't know how I was going to be received. And I didn't know in that women's prison, which is the prison I would have gone to. And because I'm a rule follower, I would have been in Oprah's secret reading book club. But this time I was going with her. So, you know what I mean? So I didn't know if I was going to see someone I knew or how they would react, in general, the women in there. And I went in, it's really like one of the most amazing things I've done in the last year. You can't tell them, it's not like a prison book club, everyone's on a group text to be like, hey, the author's coming to visit. Oprah had told them about the book before she had told the public. And Simon Schuster donated like 800 copies into the prison. So it was everywhere. So we made the plans, this is to go in and do the book club. And so they were all cheering for her, like, probably 200 people. And they didn't know I was coming. And I was like, are they going to be mad at me? Like what, like I was just really worried about it. And Oprah walked in first, and then she goes, Mama Love is here. And like, I felt like the Oprah rock star because women jumped up, they started crying, they're waving, and I just started crying because it's one thing. And I love when like the book club women across the country who've never been to jail, never will go to jail, are like, I feel seen in this book. But what I really wanted to do, but it hit differently when all those women from various backgrounds, various times, prison, some will never get out, felt seen in my book too. And that like, it was those are some of my closest readers. They would be like, this one sentence on this page, what did you mean there? And we'd talk about it, and can you sign this one page? It was like really, and they're supposed to share the books and they didn't. So I had to go back again and do book club with more books. And I'm going back, in the end of the first week of April to do it again. But it really, you're so lost and forgotten when you're locked up. And even in the jail and prison system, because you're the smallest population, you're lost and forgotten when it comes to programming, and people like, they're like, oh yeah, give that to the women too, so it just it feels really good. The last time I went in there, we got to have pizza. I don't know if they're going to let me have it this time, but I remember how much a slice of pizza would have meant, so I'm like, if they're not bringing pizza, they don't have the budget, I will buy the pizza and bring it in for book club. But we had flowers. They made a big poster, and it's like really some of the most real, honest conversations, because it's easy to talk about hope from our side of our computer cameras, right? But how do you have hope when you're in that situation? When some of those women have been on death row, some of those women will not get out, will not see their children again, will not get a second chance ever, or not for 40 years. Like, how do you sustain hope in that situation? That's really what all the conversations have been about. And, I was like, okay, Oprah, I got this one, like it was really, it was really my favorite book club I've done.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
To answer your question, you're a hope merchant. Like, you are giving them hope.
Yeah.
I'm terribly sorry about your friend that passed away from overdose, and happy anniversary for being sober. When you got out, what was that like? And what was one part of you that jail changed forever?
I remember Here's what I aspirationally wanted it to change forever. It did in increments. It took a while, but I remember being in jail. And of course, in the book, there's not actually that, maybe the first third of the book is in jail, and there's actually not that many scenes in jail. And they're like, I told this story because it fits thematically, or it's kind of funny, or what, it fits the theme of power, whatever it is. But I remember being in jail and saying, if and when I get out of here, I will never be afraid of anything ever again.
Mm.
Right? Because I had this realization of how I'd lived most of my life in total fear from the time I was a kid, and acted out of fear, and acted from like the push of pain rather than the pull of like vision or something else. Right. And so I was like, I'll never be afraid. I used to take 20 Vicodin to call PG&E, to make a payment arrangement. Like I was so afraid. I was so afraid all the time of everything. And hiding that. I'd never tell you. I would say I'm the most fearless, independent woman you ever met, but I was deathly afraid every minute of every day before that. And I was afraid a lot of days in there, but I was like, I'm gonna get through this and I'll never be afraid again. The problem with that is I had no idea. Like, I really believed I'm going to serve my sentence. I'm going to do what the justice system asks of me. Like, I deserve that. I'm going to do it. I'm going to do my sentence. I'm going to follow the rules. I'm going to do probation and follow the rules, and then I will be done. And I had no idea that I would never be done. And I would never, that I potentially would never be done. Pain, in some ways, I'm still not done in weird ways, right? It doesn't matter how many New York Times bestsellers you write. That system, well, in many ways, you are never done. And all the ways I would be expected to pay that were illogical. Like, luckily, I had no idea, because I don't know if I could have done it if I had known. I thought, look, I'm in control of my fate. As long as I don't ever do a drug again and never commit a crime again, I will never go back to jail. Because when I left, I said, I'm never coming back here. I promise you that. And but I didn't know all the ways, how easy it is to go back for reasons that have nothing to do with committing a crime. It has to do with, bureaucracy and, 3 agencies in the county wanting you to drug test at the same time for different places at once, or else you go to jail. I didn't know how to take the bus, and I didn't have a car. Well, if you don't get there, you'll go to jail. If you, I can't get this job because of background check, but if you don't get a job, you'll go to jail and you won't get your son back. Like, all of these things are just set up to fail. And there's a lot of illogical consequences that lasted. Like, I can write a book for Stanford professors, but I can't homeschool my son because I went to jail. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like, everything you are before that moment of arrest and going to jail gets erased. And the system works really hard to erase everything you could be after, and it's a really lonely, scary place to be. I had dreams every week for well over a decade, where I'm having to go back to jail. Now I may have it every few months. So it used to be like, every week, and I've done nothing wrong. This is like probation trauma, right? Which I had no idea. How would you know, right? And it's privilege that I didn't know. I acknowledge that, but like, I had no idea, because I really believed you pay and you're done, and I just, it is crazy how it pops up in weird ways. Like, I just, I sold my house, really grateful to have a house to sell. I never thought I would own a house, in the fall. And I just, I was moving, I'm in Hawaii now, I was moving here, and I'm like, oh, I'm going to rent for a while, and I just gone through a divorce. And so I'm like starting over, and like, I'm empty nesting, took Kane to college. And I was like, oh no, I have to go through a property management company. Like, what if they don't rent to me because I have a criminal back? Like, and then I got so triggered and scared, like, I'm not going to have a place for Caden and I to live when he's home from college, like, and I have places to stay, and but like, it doesn't matter. They don't, that system doesn't care that I know Oprah, or that I
Right.
have, I have this resume, this bio that if I hear it, I'm like, that she sounds cool. Right. And so that stuff is super like traumatizing and triggering. And there's all these little things like that, like, and I'm like, wait, I can't go to Canada. I'm not going to hurt Canada. But, like, there's all these like illogical punishments and ways we want people to never forget that you were once this worst version of you, and so right before, the whole year before my book came out, after I'd written the first draft, I was working really hard to launch a nonprofit to help. It's trauma and gender responsive service just for incarcerated women, right? So programming while they're in custody, and then 18 months of support after. So no one's going back to jail or losing their children because, like me at the time, they don't have a car that can go uphill. Like I just, I had a car that like I can be there as long as it's not uphill, So, jail is it's humbling, and it's illogical though, and that's just like the system and these weird rules and these weird ways. And then there's like all of the, the isolation that comes from having that be part of your story, and people's judgment and gossip. And like, I remember I had gotten Caden back, and he's in first grade, and some mom at back to school night was like, hey, my son loves your son. They love to play together. Like, do you want to have a play date? I can drop my son at your house. And I was like, oh, but if you know my past, you probably wouldn't want to do that. And I can't tell you my past, but I don't want to like put you in that position, and I'm not going to tell you. And so like, that's how you're isolated too, right?
That's tough.
Yeah. Cause I was like, oh, you might not want to invite me into your house. Like I had that, and that's shame too.
Yeah.
Now, and I used to have this thing where like you're sitting next to an airplane, and someone on an airplane, they're like, oh, what do you do? Oh, you write a book. What's it about? And I'm like, oof. I don't know. I don't know who you are. Like, it's not shame for me. It's just like empathy. It's like, oh, this is might make you really uncomfortable. And then you're going to be sitting next to me. And like, and there's a little, so there's a little of that stuff that pops up now, but it's not, like once you tell all your secrets, there's so much freedom in that. Like telling all your secrets it feels better than any drug I've ever taken in my life, to be honest. Because then you're like so much, it's just lighter. And, it's exhausting to remember who you're pretending to be so you can be that. If you're just you, wow, there's a lot more time for activities in the day, right?
So true. All right. So I asked you if you could talk to a younger version of yourself, what you would say to her, and you said you would want to ask for help, right? So if the younger version of you could say anything to you now, what do you think she would say?
All right. Who's Oprah Winfrey now with this question? I think my younger self would remind me of my younger self and tell me to have more compassion quicker for myself. She would say, look what we survived. Like, we're pretty amazing.
She's right. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
What do you hope people take away from your book? If it could be your greatest hope of all that you can achieve, what would you want that to be?
It depends on the audience. I think for someone like me, like for an incarcerated woman or a person, anyone who's been in the justice system, I wasted so many years in shame unnecessarily, and so I would want them to own their story a lot quicker than I did, and be compassionate and forgive themselves a lot quicker than I did, because no one should take 11, 12 years of that, and to know their goodness and their worth regardless of that, that worst moment or that worst, the sum of a rap sheet, right? But I think for the people who haven't been incarcerated, and it's just the general public reader, I want them to think about what second chances mean for real, right? Because like, I can go up to any person, probably, I believe most people are pretty good, and say, do you believe in second chances? They'd be like, oh yeah, of course. Like that's, but then if you dig a little deeper, do you believe in second chances enough to be friends with that second chance? Do you believe enough to like invite that second chance into your home, to hire that second chance, to give that second chance a place to live, rent to them, all things being equal, of course, to include them in your church community, because, um, there's that saying we're only as sick as our secrets, but like, this shame and the stigma just multiplies in isolation. And and I would say, and that's really hard. Like I have no judgment about that. It's really hard, like it's really hard to get beyond our own biases sometimes that are when they're just sort of ingrained in us, right? Like to notice it and look at it and then like act differently, because that's who we are and who we aspire to be. I also like really believe that people will rise to the level that you believe in them. I really, really do believe that in general, which might be a little naive and Pollyanna given my history, but I do believe that. And I think especially people who have lost everything and are desperate to prove their value and worth, and the joy of someone trusting you again when you feel like no one trusts you and when you have no credibility, like I can give you all the reasons why a formerly incarcerated person, woman specifically, would make your best employee. But mostly it's that thing, like I was so desperate to feel like I had value to the world again, that I worked hard. I became a better mother because the minute I got out, like if I say I'm going to show up, I show up. And I did that minute after minute, day after day, week after week, month, year after year, decade after decade. Like, well, it hasn't been more than one decade, but I show up. Like I want to be who the best person believes me to be, like my best self. And so I do think there's just so much power. And sometimes you just need that one person who's like, no, I believe in you. And that's not, so I don't know. That was not one powerful thing, but it's all of those things. It's just that we're all like more than the worst thing we've done or been,
I love that.
Yeah.
When it's all said and done and people talk about you, what is it that you would want to be remembered for or as?
Mm. I don't know that I have a whole lot of drive to have people I don't know what they're going to talk about me or remember me for, but for my children, and someday I'll have grandchildren and maybe and great grandchildren, all of that. And I think what I most want, just kind of go back to the beginning of our conversation, like I come from a long line of women who keep secrets and pretend. And so I want to be known as the woman who stopped that, right? And who didn't run, who turned around and be like, okay, here's the opposite of keeping secrets. My children know everything about they had to read my book, right? So, and I think that nothing gets better in silence, nothing in secrets. You know how you said at the beginning of our conversation, like, wait, did you grow up in my house? Like that's what everyone needs to know, right? Like that's how things change, where you like, you just need to not be alone. You have one person be like, yeah, I understand, or I've been there, or I don't judge you, or I have, so I think I want to be known as stopping that trauma in my family, and it's interesting because that became so visceral to me when I took my youngest to college, Caden, who was taken into foster care, when I was arrested. It was really, when I took him to college, like moved him into the dorm. He's at UC San Diego. And I moved him into the dorm and I was parking my car. And it was the first time. And again, this was like a year ago. I already had 6 New York Times bestsellers. I already had look, Desmond Tutu and Nelson Mandela said this about me. I had my resume of goodness for the world. Right. But it was really in that moment that I felt like it was the first time I exhaled since my arrest, because I was like, we did it in that moment, right? Because he's statistically more likely, having 2 incarcerated parents, to be going to prison, not UC San Diego with a 4.0. And it wasn't about achieve. I never was like achieve. It was like my whole view on parenting changed from my arrest. It used to be like, I hope my children all get into Stanford because I didn't, like that was my mentality. And then when I got out, I was like, I hope my children are so happy. And that has directed my parenting. Like there was nothing we couldn't talk about the minute I got out of jail. There's no like, I'm the parent who knows it all. It was like, I understand, and their friends could talk about, but it was that moment when I was like, wow, this is the end of the story of that particular thing of that story. Because statistically it could have gone so different,
Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah.
I think if being the cycle breaker is what you want to be known for, like
Well, that's a much more efficient way to say all of that. I just blathered on. Thank you.
I much prefer your
Thank
bladder.
you for editing me. We all need an editor.
All right, last question.
Yeah.
If someone listening right now feels trapped, whether it's addiction, shame, or past that they can't escape, what would you say to them and what would you want them to know?
I would want them to know that they're not as alone as they think they are, and they're only as alone as they want to be. And to reach out. Everybody has someone they can tell. And my biggest fear is if I told you the truth of what I was going through, you would run screaming out of the room. And what I learned from doing this book, where I told all my secrets and I shared the worst version of me I've ever been, and me at my darkest and lowest, and where I was really wanted to make sure I was the only villain in my story. The thing I feared most with the vulnerability of that was that people would run away, and the opposite happens. They run to you. Like people want to help. Like I do believe people are good, even though the world is crazy. Like I do believe that in an individual level, human to human, that there's so much goodness in people. And I think nothing is as bad in real life as it is in our imaginations, right? That took me a long time to learn. That could be a whole nother podcast, but so yeah, I think just be brave enough. I was not brave enough just to be honest. It took me a long time to get the honesty, braveness. Now I might be a little too honest, but it's all right. I'd rather have the pendulum go that way than the other way.
Thank you for that. Thank you for this. This was an amazing conversation. Your story is absolutely phenomenal. Thank you for sharing from such a open and honest, vulnerable place. Thank you for not having secrets.
Yeah.
Thank you for being the cycle breaker, all the things. If somebody wanted to find you online or on social media, where can they find you?
Instagram, much to my youngest son's dismay, where he calls me cringe. It's at Lara Love Hardin. And then the nonprofit is the gemmaproject.org if anyone's interested in like learning more about what life is like for incarcerated women. And yeah, that's the thing. I do have one more secret I have to tell you.
Sure.
I was rooting for the Chiefs.
And
are we okay? Done. Are we good?
Sure, and because they got blown out. So I'm
never air.
It's gonna get buried until like December. Yeah. It's all good. That's all good.
All right, it's all good. I just, I've been looking at that champion eagle thing, but
yeah.
It's mostly because I do, I'll admit this. I do like the Taylor Swift love story situation.
You're a Swiftie?
Yeah. I mean, I'm a love story thing person. I just think it's sweet. But yeah.
I think the Eagles winning the Super Bowl is much more of a love story for Philly fans.
All right. Fair enough. Fair enough.
Also, if people want to find your book, where can they find your book?
Oh, anywhere. Bookstores, Amazon, Simon Schuster page, Audible, Kindle. I will say the paperback has the 2024 bonus chapter. The hardback does not. And so when the paperback just came out in February 2025, and so because life keeps on lifing and memoirs end, Simon Schuster had me update it because the drama continues. So,
all right. Yeah. Well, again, thank you so much for this. Thank you for your story, for your courage, your bravery, all of it. Thank you for who you are. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for how you do it.
Same. Same, right back at you.